Hi, I'm Steve Endo, and I'm a Microsoft Dynamics GP MVP. And today I'd like to warn you about using max or min in your Dynamics GP queries and how the ANSI padding setting can affect your query performance. Let's get started. So I made two other videos where I compared the performance of max versus top 1, and as part of that process, I found something odd when I queried the IV30500 table. It worked fine for some fields, but when I tried the transaction source field, max had very poor performance, and we saw that the index scan returned every row in the table, whereas top 1 had very good performance and it always returned just one row. So for some reason, certain fields in IV30500, like posted date, were fine. Max and top 1 had equivalent performance, but transaction source had very poor performance. But I didn't know why. So I reached out to Kendra Little, and if you're not familiar with Kendra Little, she is a data platform MVP or SQL Server MVP, and she has a blog at littlekendra.com, and she has excellent online SQL Server courses available at sqlworkbooks.com. And so I asked her what might be causing this. I was able to reproduce the situation, package it up in a nice, simple example, and she was able to reproduce it. And she started to hone in on what the problem might be very quickly. And she asked, well, why does this table have odd ANSI settings? Why are they all turned off? And I explained the background of Dynamics GP, and that's what we were taught. So let's do a little recap of the performance issues and some of the settings, and I'll share some of the things that she explained to me. So here you see the two queries that I was running, where I compared the max and the top 1 against the transaction source field of IV30500. And if I execute that to get the actual execution plan, and let me zoom in here, we see that the max function returned 147,000 records on that index scan. Not good. Whereas the top 1 only returned one row. As a result, we have over 99% of the cost, nearly 100% of the cost going to the max query, with only 0.4 going to a top 1 query. So this was the huge performance difference that I was seeing. Now for comparison, when I performed this same set of queries against the rebuild table, where I had exported data from IV30500 into the rebuild table to create a new table from scratch, I didn't see these performance issues. So if I run that and look at the execution plan, you will see here that the max function only returns one row from the rebuild index scan. So very interesting results, and we see a 50-50 cost here where max and top 1 perform very similar. So that was the question we're looking to answer. And so Kendra sent me a query to take a look at the settings on the table. And this takes a look at the metadata for the table, and here we see IV305 transaction source field, ANSI padding is off. And this is what you would expect in a typical Dynamics GP table. All of the car fields will have that turned off. But my rebuild table, take a look at that. This was the table that was created by SQL Server when I used the data export import wizard. It created this table, scripted it out for me, and ANSI padding is on. Very interesting. Now, ANSI padding on is the default setting of a SQL Server Management Studio query window or connection or scripts. So normally these will be on, but Dynamics GP, longtime consultants will know, we normally turn this setting off whenever we install and configure GP. And whenever GP databases are scripted, ANSI padding is turned off. And if you're familiar with the Dynamics GP ODBC DSN setup, when you go into configure here and click next, we are trained to always turn off these two ANSI options. Do not use ANSI quoted identifiers and do not use ANSI nulls, paddings, and warnings. And the one that is significant here is paddings. So we see that when ANSI padding is off, performance is poor when we use the max function. When it gets turned on, the performance of the max function is fine. So what is going on? Well, Kendra found documentation on the ANSI padding setting, and so I read a little bit about this. This setting determines how SQL Server stores values that may have trailing blanks. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, there's a little more information on how SQL Server compares strings with trailing spaces. And Kendra explained that it looks like SQL Server is having, when it's performing a comparison or evaluating values in a char or varchar field, it's having to pad the character strings so that they're all the same length before it can compare them. Okay, and so what is happening is when ANSI padding is off, SQL Server has to scan every row, pad all of those values before it can compare them. But with ANSI padding on, it can take a little shortcut and say, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to skip the padding, and I'm just going to compare the main field value, its contents without the padding. So that's a pretty significant difference. And then she found a third article here about set ANSI padding, and it talks about how this is effectively a deprecated feature with SQL Server 2016 and forward, and this feature may eventually go away in a future edition of SQL Server. And here we see a description of what happens when the setting is on or what happens when it's off, and we go down and we notice this key phrase. When ANSI padding is set to off, queries that involve min, max, or top on character columns might be slower than in SQL Server 2000, apparently when this behavior was implemented in SQL Server. And sure enough, in SQL Server 2014, when I'm doing this comparison, we are seeing very poor performance when ANSI padding is off using the max function. So this explains the problem. The Dynamics GP ANSI padding off default causes a severe performance penalty when you're doing a min or max operation on these char fields. Now, the documentation notes that it could affect the top operator as well. I wasn't able to reproduce that in my simple queries, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's a scenario where that could come up. So that is the difference. And now, how do we validate this? Well, what I'm going to do is run another statement that Kendra provided. And this is an alter table, alter column statement. It doesn't actually change anything in the table. It just redefines the column with the exact same data type that it already is. And watch what happens after we run that. So now let's comment that out, rerun our queries, and you'll notice this has now set the transaction source column to have ANSI padding on. So let's go back to my query here, rerun this, and take a look at the execution plan. And like magic, we now have a 50-50 cost comparing max and top one, and our max function is only returning one record as a result of the index scan. So the ANSI padding on changes the behavior of the query optimizer so that this index scan does not have to go through every single row and pad those field values. It can just grab the top one and return it. Dramatic changes in query performance and query cost. That is a long story about a seemingly simple question that has a very obscure and not so easy to find answer. But Kendra was able to find it. So what did we learn here? Well, first, we learned that Kendra Little is a definite SQL Server expert. Within a couple of hours, just pondering this, she was able to narrow down the likely cause and then figure out exactly what the problem was by digging through the SQL Server documentation. Pretty sure I would have never been able to figure this out. And the other lesson is obscure SQL Server settings can affect performance. This one I would say is pretty obscure, and the implementation of it in SQL Server, and specifically how it affects the min, max, and top operators, wow, that is very surprising. So the lesson for anyone who works with Dynamics GP queries is that the ANSI padding off setting can negatively impact some query operators, being min, max, and top. And again, I wasn't able to demonstrate that performance issue with top, but min and max, definitely I can see that happening. Now, I'm guessing min and max aren't widely used by many queries, but if you're performing them on any large table, you will take a significant performance hit, and you may want to consider switching those over to top one queries instead. So I hope you found this journey interesting, And feel free to follow me on Twitter at SteveEndo and check out my blog at dynamicsgplan.blogspot.com.